All steering boxes are designed to give more physical lock than the vehicle requires. So just as using this as a rough example, if your vehicle has 4 turns lock to lock, 2 each way, the steering box is likely to be 5 turns. You'll got an extra half a turn of lock each way. What that's for is to stop the piston from bottoming out inside the casing. It's not good practice. It's almost like a shock absorber of oil at the end of either lock. So when the vehicle's on full lock, if the road wheel comes into contact with something, it's got something to absorb that shock. Not having them set correctly means that when the vehicle hits its physical stop on the lock stop, the steering box will continue to try to power. Now, under normal circumstances, even fully laden on a hard surface, static vehicle, 1200 psi at the most is probably all the steering box will require. The pump itself, though, potentially could be unlimited or could give at least 3500 psi. You've hit a dead stop because your wheels don't want to go any further because the lock stops won't allow it, but the steering box wants to. So pulling on the steering wheel, if they're not set correctly, would then mean that engine note would drop because you're loading the power steering pump up heavily. Increased pressure in the hydraulic lines, which is a safety issue there, an element, because you're going to be going up to 3,500 psi potentially at the end of lock. That overworks all the seals in the steering box, which can cause premature failure. Also, what it does is it bends drag links, forces drag links into actually rubbing on the chassis. So you get fouling on full lock, it's going too far. Pump failure, early pump failure, because definitely the pump's now working 3 times as hard as it ever really needs to work, because quite simply, you've not set those relief valves. Well, obviously, if you don't do the setting procedure and you were to leave that valve like that, you'll get the old one, and I've had many a phone call. I've fitted a steering box and I've only got 1 turn each way. It won't go any further. I've tried to set these valves and they won't set because people miss the dead simple one as they're trying to do it with the weight down. Once you've filled it with oil and the weight's down on the wheels, you're now going to try and crush that valve. It's impossible because all that weight's down there, and as soon as that valve depresses the needle valve, then you get a full relief of the hydraulic system and it will never go. Jack it up, even with the oil in, you can still do this. Jack it up and then wind it lock to lock again and force it to the end, and you'll find then that that was the mistake you'd made. Well, obviously, when you switch the engine off, it'll tend to chuck half a litre of fluid out of the reservoir. That's one of the main things. Oil gets aerated, goes very much like a milkshake, very pinky. If it gets like that, don't try to get the oil out of the system, because the air out of the system, because you're fighting a losing battle. Once the oil's aerated, that means the air has actually got into the oil. You then need to leave the vehicle standing 2 to 3 hours with the top off the reservoir, and that air that's aerated the oil and made it milky will actually find its own way back out, and only then at that point would you start to try and bleed the system again. Well, what you need to do there is fully cleanse the system. Filters need changing. You need to remove all the hydraulic hoses off the system and clean applicably, whether with a pressure washer or professionally cleaned. You need to expel as much of the old oil out of the steering box as you can, so you can sit up in the cab and you can wind it lock to lock over a suitable container and expel as much oil out of the box. Refit all your pipework, new filters, and fill with fresh clean oil before you even think about fitting another pump on. One of the biggest mistakes is that people will have a pump that fails, they take the pump off it, okay, they lose a certain amount of oil and the reservoir empties itself, but the lines running down from the pump to the steering box are still holding the old oil, potentially with the contamination in there. You fit a new pump on, you top it up with oil rather than cleansing the system, and 2 months down the line you've got another pump failing on you because of basically the incorrect fitment of the first one. It's possible. It is possible. Again, this is why we say you must expel as much oil as you can. If the contamination is quite substantial, which you can see yourself in the oil, if you can physically see contamination in oil, then the box needs to come off. Quite simply, you could have a vehicle that's been running, you've done no work on the power steering system at all, and then the following day it's chucking oil out the reservoir. Where do I start? You start quite simply on the suction side of the pump. So don't go looking down the chassis at all the lines running to the steering box. Don't look at the steering box. Don't look at the return line out of the steering box. It is physically impossible on a hydraulic circuit for it to draw air in anywhere other than on the suction side of the circuit. So in other words, between the reservoir itself, the pipework running to the pump that's drawing the oil into the pump. After that, it can't draw air in. So you're looking at that pipework, you're looking at dowty washers and O-rings on the fitting that face on the pump itself. You're looking at the hose running from the reservoir to the pump. Just because it's dry, don't necessarily assume that that's not the problem. Very often, when you've got air being drawn into a hydraulic system, there'll be no leaks because it will draw air past a washer, a copper washer. You should never reuse copper washers or dowty washers. You should always renew them. And the one other place that people don't look that is on the suction side of the pump is the actual shaft seal of the pump itself. So if the engine is pushing gases past the shaft seal of the pump, they'll get into the hydraulic system, aerate the hydraulic system and make it appear that you've got air getting in there when in actual fact the shaft seal of the pump is causing the problem. So it's from really the pump to the reservoir is where you should be looking and changing associated pipework or fittings. For sure. I mean, there's no real reason at all for hydraulic oil to become discoloured. I mean, it can slightly if it gets too hot, but in general terms, it certainly wouldn't go black. If your power steering oil, is black, that's a clear sign that the shaft seal on the pump is allowing the engine oil to integrate into the hydraulic system. It doesn't take a lot for that to happen, but the trouble is once engine oil gets in there, the high carbon content in that oil then gets at the seals of the power steering system and into the valves, and the whole lot goes downhill. It's a fail in the weighting.